In this chapter, we will be talking about learning, memory, and amnesia. So we will be defining what learning is and how do we store this acquired skill and knowledge, and we refer to it as memory, and also amnesia, or the pathological loss of these memories. So it's also important to review your lessons or remember concepts, most especially in the chapters on anatomy of the nervous system, as well as neural conduction and synaptic transmission, because we will be studying what structures of the brain are involved in memory formation, in learning, and also what happens, what are the chemical processes that is involved, or what neurotransmitters are released, what ions are being used in order to form the memories. So to start, let's define the concepts learning, memory, and amnesia. So when we say learning, this is how experience changes in the brain. So if you can recall in the previous chapter, our brain has a characteristics of being neuroplastic or neuroplasticity, right? So it means that our brain adapts to our environment, and we adapt through the process of learning. So learning is like the acquisition of skill or knowledge. And when you say memory, this deals with how these changes are stored in the brain. So in other words, memory is like an expression of what you have acquired. Learning is your acquired skill, or it could be knowledge, and the way we express it is our memory. Okay, so for example, you are learning a new language. So you learn through studying it or by studying it, but you then speak it using your memory to retrieve the words that you have learned. Okay, so that's how different and also how learning and memory works hand in hand. Amnesia is the pathological loss of memory. So when say pathological, it might be caused of a disease or by some medical condition. And then we will study what are the possible causes of amnesia and what specific brain structures and chemical processes are responsible for these three concepts. So let's start discussing this person named Henry Gustav Molaison. So his case is actually a very significant contribution to the study and the advancement and the study of memory and amnesia. So HM, so this person is better known as HM. So he suffered an average of one generalized seizure each week and many partial seizures each day. So what you have learned in the previous chapter, when you say generalized seizure, so it affects all areas in the brain, okay? And partial seizures, only some parts of the brain. And usually generalized seizures accompany unconsciousness, but partial seizures, usually conscious pa ang tao ang time. Despite massive doses of the anticonvulsant medication. So nagpa-test si HM using electroencephalography, and it suggested that the convulsions arose from the foci in the medial portions of both his left and right temporal lobes. Since maumanay ni gawa sa test, so the doctors and the researchers as well suggested nga kuhaon ta ng apart, since this is what is causing, probably what is causing the convulsions and the epileptic seizures. So the procedure is called the bilateral medial temporal lobectomy. So this is the removal of the medial portions of both temporal lobes, including most of the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the adjacent cortex. So let's differentiate first what lobectomy is, and you also have this procedure called lobotomy. So when we say lobectomy, this is an operation in which a lobe or a major part of the lobe is removed from the brain. So kwaon gid siya completely. When we say lobotomy, this is an operation in which a lobe or a major part of one is just separated from the rest of the brain by a large cut, but it is not removed. So in this picture, as you can see, this is a lobotomy. Okay, so in this portion here, there's a large cut. Okay, So giseparate ra simply kining apart from the rest of the part, but it's not being removed. On the other hand, lobectomy is really removing that a major part or a major lobe of the brain. So since HM's case involved is a lobectomy, so gi-remove dito ang medial portions of both temporal lobes. Again, areas involved is you have the hippocampus, most of the hippocampus, and as what you have learned, this is have a significant function in terms of memory, amygdala, emotions, okay, and adjacent cortexes, which we'll be discussing later. So this is now the picture of, or the area, or the portions of the medial temporal lobes that were removed in HM's brain. So in this one, here, the area shaded purple. So again, it was advised to be removed because of, according to the EEG, the convulsions and the epileptic seizures originated in this area. So hence it will be removed, or it was removed in the hopes of eliminating the seizures. Here's another angle and also a comparison of HM's brain and the normal brain. Okay, so this is the area here that was removed. Okay, and if you compare it to the normal brain, so this is like a hollow structure, no? Okay, and in this angle, okay, so this is the area that was removed, and in the normal brain, if as you can see, about a large part or most of the hippocampus will be affected. Also the amygdala and parts of the parahippocampal region. So the surgery was performed, and then mo ni siyang effects ni HM no, after the surgery. So first is the memory for events predating the surgery remained largely intact. So when we say predating gani, meaning before. So events or memories that was formed before the surgery, makahinumdum pa si HM ato. Next, short-term memory is also intact. It remained normal. So this was assessed using a digit span test. When we say digit span test, the examiner presents numbers to the examinee. For example, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the examinee repeats this. So maka-repeat pa man si HM. So maka-store pa siya nga information. Hence, it was considered that the short-term memory was still normal. However, there was almost total inability to form new long-term memories. Okay? So meaning dili siya ka he's unable to remember their new address. So right after the surgery and sometime later they moved to a new place. And unfortunately, HM cannot remember his new address. He also fails to recognize close friends of family that was being introduced to him right after the surgery. And events fade before the day is over. His experience seems to be that of a person who is just becoming aware of his surroundings without fully comprehending the situation. So it's like, so ang iyara yung mahinungduman is katong mga past events no, before sa iyang surgery, and unfortunately dili na siya ka form of new memories. Although since yung short-term memory kay intact pa man, so if he pays attention to some specific objects, kana makinumdum siya if mo pay attention siya. For example, if I am talking right now to HM, conscious siya na nga, he is aware that he's talking to me. But after that, if he shifts his attention to another person or to another task, he would completely forget nga nakig-interact siya nako. Okay, so muna no ang effects sa surgery ni HM. So it was very tragic for him. So tungod of this very adverse side effects of the operation. So wala na gini siya, never nagi-perform ang medial temporal lobectomy, because although ni improved tuod ang seizures, however that's the effect, diba? So memories, he cannot form new memories. And psychologically speaking, our memories play a large part, no, of our identity as a person. So if wala kay memories, you're like a hollow, no? A hollow shell of a person. Assessing the amnesic effects of brain surgery. So these are the things learned before and after the surgery. So you have retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. So when you say retrograde amnesia, no, retro meaning backward acting. So meaning makalimot ka sa mga memories that was formed before in the past. Okay? But you can still form new memories. So for example, if I had a surgery today, I might most likely forget my past events or past happenings. So that's retrograde amnesia. But I can still form new memories. But for anterograde amnesia, it's forward acting. So I cannot form new memories, and I can only remember the things that happened before the trauma or before the surgery. Okay. So in HM's case, what he experienced or what his condition is anterograde amnesia. Kay dili man siya ka form og new memories. Iyang mahinumduman is katurang events that happened in the past or before the lobectomy. So after the surgery, these are the tests that were used in order to assess HM's anterograde amnesia or the discovery of unconscious memories. So unsa may pasabot anang unconscious memory. So later on, we will discuss what is meant by that. Unconscious memories, it is also referred to as implicit memories. So you have the digit span, okay, block tapping memory span test, mirror drawing test, rotary pursuit test, the incomplete pictures test, and the Pavlovian conditioning. So again, these are the tests used to assess the type of amnesia HM experienced. Okay, starting with the digit span test. So this is a classic test of verbal long-term memory. So this is a verbal test. So the process is that HM was asked to repeat 5 digits that were read to him at a 1 second intervals. And then on the next trial, the same 5 digits were presented in the same sequence with one new digit added in the end. And this same 6-digit sequence was presented a few times until he got it right. And then another digit was added to the end of it, and so on. And after 25 trials, HM had not managed to repeat the 8-digit sequence. And normal subjects can correctly repeat about 15 digits after 25 trials of the digit span plus 1 test. So in other words, so there's a problem involving the long-term memory. Okay, dili siya ka-store. Kay normal subjects would could correctly repeat 15. Siya kay maglisod na siya no sa 8 digit pa lang. So this is a verbal test. So affected yung verbal long-term memory. The next test is the block tapping memory span test. So the task in this test is that the examiner would tap specific blocks in order or there's a pattern. So for example, ang examiner mo tap sa block colored purple and then blue and then red and then green. Okay, and then the examinee would follow. And unfortunately, HM cannot follow. So, and because of the result, naa siya'y global amnesia. So, say global amnesia, it's amnesia for information presented in all sensory modalities. So this demonstrated that HM's amnesia was not restricted to verbal material. Okay, di ba sa previous test, it was verbal long-term memory, katong digit span. But also in the block tapping, maglisod po siya or most likely yung performance is poor no compared to that of a normal person or a person nga wala kuhay og kanang medial temporal lobes. So also amnesia for all sensory modalities. Again, that is called global amnesia. The next test is the mirror drawing test. So ang buhaton sa examinee ani is, so in the picture, okay, you can see there's a mirror, there's an object, there's a pencil, and na block or something para moali sa picture. So ang task ani is si HM, iyaning subayon ang drawing sa star. But kailangan ang ihang drawing should be kanang right at the borders of the star, so dapat dili siya mulapas. And dili gid siya kakita sa actual star, but mutanaw siya dito sa amin or sa mirror. So that's why it's called the mirror drawing test. And unsaon pag-measure ana is through the number of errors. Okay, so error siya, considered siya nga error if mulapas siya sa boundary sa star. Okay, so in this graph, you can see here, so day 1, day 2, and day 3. And kining y-axis, it refers to the errors made by HM. So the x-axis is the number of trials. So at the first trial, grabe pa kay error si HM. So around 30, no? 30 errors. So ka-30 siya mula pa sa star nga iyang gi-trace. That's for day 1. But as the trial progresses, magagamay po diyang errors, as you can see in the graph. 20 na lang after second trial, after the fourth trial around 10, and then after the 10th trial in day 1, so below 10 na lang errors. And the next day, day 2, still nagkaubos ang error. Okay, so kuha na lang siya, around 50 na lang, and then the next trial for day 2, so wala na error, and so on. And the day 3 pag yun, still nagka-improve iyang performance. So what does this imply? So this is the first indication that HM's anterograde amnesia did not involve long-term memories came from the result of a mirror drawing test. So meaning dili tanang aspects of long-term memory was affected in HM. Diba kay kung nawala gid completely ang long-term memory, then dapat dili siya mo improve. Diba dili siya mo improve sa iyang performance. In other words, kay ni-improve man siya, that means HM learned, no, nakakat-on siya ani nga task. But if imo siya pangutan-on, maka-recall ba ka sa time nga gipahimo ka og mirror drawing test, dili siya ka-recall. Okay? So kana nga, so diba, so there are two aspects of memory as you can see in this test. So dili siya ka-recall nga nagbuhat sa mirror drawing test, pero unconsciously, implicitly ni-improve iyang performance. So in other words, naka-learn siya. So this goes to show that it did not involve all long-term memories. Okay, so later on we will discuss so unsa magiging specific part of long-term memory disrupted, no, from the surgery. Another test is the rotary pursuit test. Okay, so in this picture again, so si HM, so this is a rotating disc and this is the target kani siya, no. So ang task ni HM is iyang ning ibuta ang stylo sa target, sa rotating target, and iyan ang sundon while nag-rotate ang disc. Okay. So HM learned and retained this task, although he had no conscious recollection of the learning trials. So same with the mirror drawing test, na-improve iyang performance aning rotary pursuit test. So as trials progresses, nagka-improve iyang performance. In other words, nakat-on gyapon siya, naka-learn gyapon siya sa task. But then again, if pangutan-on nimo siya, do you remember kanang nibuhat ka aning rotary pursuit test? No, I cannot remember that. But unconsciously, gihapon, nakakat-on siya or naka-learn siya. Another test, you have the incomplete pictures test. Okay, so this is a non-sensory motor test of memory that employs 5 sets of fragmented drawings. So you have set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4, and set 5. And kada set, each set contains drawing of the same 20 objects. Okay, so same ra na silang objects tanan. Tag 20 each. But they differ, ang ilang difference is the degree of fragmentation. So if you can notice, set 1 is very fragmented, but you cannot almost identify what that object is. But set 2, magka-progress ang sets, magka-form pod ang object. So you have an elephant in an umbrella. Okay. So ang task ni HM diri is mo identify, the subject is asked to identify the 20 objects from the sketchiest set first. Okay, set 1. So muni ang una ihatag. And then those objects that go unrecognized, katong dili siya katag-an, for example, dili siya katag-an ani, okay? The unrecognized objects are presented in the next version. So set 2 na pod, hantod matag-an na niya. And so on until all 20 items have been identified. So in this graph, muna yung results no for sets 1 to 4. Okay, so the y-axis again, kay muna siya ang errors made by HM. Okay, so sa set 1, katong the pinaka-fragmented nga drawings, logically, mas daghan ginag-errors, no? Kaya di man kayo siya maklaro. So around maybe 13 ni siya diri nga part. But for set 2, okay, nigamay na siya. Kaya of course, familiar naman siya sa pag first set. So around 7, and then magka-klaro ang sets, magka-lesser po ang error. Then after 1 hour, gi-retest na siya. Okay? And then if you can notice the graphs, muna siya ang graph for the retest. This is for the initial test, diba? Set 1 pa lang daan, dako na kay improvement si HM. So from the first set, from the initial test, around 13 errors. But after the retest, di ba nakaabot 6, so maybe around 5, di ba? So again, this goes to show nga naka-learn gihapon si HM. So naagya po yung aspect of his long-term memory that is still functional. Okay? So 2 items from the incomplete pictures test, HM's memory for the 20 items on the test was indicated by his ability to recognize the more fragmented versions of them when he was retested. Okay. Nevertheless, he had no conscious awareness of having previously seen these items. So same gyapon sa previous two, diba? If pangutan-on siya, have you seen this object before? Sa nga, wala pa. Diba? Pero, contradictory ang performance because the improvement siya. So if na-improve siya, then that only implies nga kita siya ana before. Pero if pangutan-on nimo siya, if nakakita ba siya ana nga object, wala daw. Okay? Another test is the Pavlovian conditioning. So for sure you're familiar with this, with the mechanisms of this, because it involves classical conditioning. So a tone was sounded just before a puff of air was administered to his eye. And these trials were repeated until the tone alone elicited an eye blink. So in this case, we have a neutral stimulus, which is the tone, the unconditioned stimulus, which is the air puff, and the unconditioned response is eye blink, or the blinking of the eye. But since the tone is frequently associated or repeatedly associated with the air puff, so the tone becomes the conditioned stimulus. So from neutral stimulus, this becomes the conditioned stimulus. And sa tone pa lang daan, wala pa air puff, mo blink na si HM. So he was able to retain this reaction. And it was stored in particular in the cerebellum. So conditioning daw can be stored in the cerebellum. So again, this goes to show nga a part of HM's long-term memory is still functional. The results of the first two tests documented HM's severe deficits in long-term memory. So you have the digit span test and the block tapping memory test, diba? So ni-fail siya ato nga mga tests. So it goes to show nga yes, there's a deficit in the long-term memory. However, the results of the latter indicated that HM's brain was capable of storing long-term memory. So you have the katong Pavlovian conditioning, the mirror task test, no? So kato sila may improvement iyang performance ato. But wala lang recollection. Dili lang kahinumdum si HM nga he did those trials. But his performance have shown otherwise because the improvement siya over time. So there are 3 major scientific contributions of HM's case. So first, it showed that the medial temporal lobes play an especially important role in memory. So as you can recall, di ba, ang part nga gikuha ato is mostly of the hippocampus, okay, amygdala, and also neighboring or adjacent cortexes. So these structures play an important role in memory. Second, it supported the theory that there are different modes of storage for you have short term, natay long term, and also remote memory. Remote memory meaning memories from the distant past. Diba? So you have learned in your Psych 1, diba, in the cognitive part of the lessons, diba, natay short-term memory, long-term memory. So it further supported that theory. Diba kay intact pa man to ang short-term memory ni HM, but some aspects of his long-term memory kay dili na. Okay, but maka-remember pa sad siya sa iyang remote memory or events that happened before the surgery. And third contribution is the creation of two distinct categories of long-term memory. Okay, diba? The tests have shown that the first two tests, especially the digit span test and the block tapping test, show that there are disruptions in the long-term memory. But the latter tests, especially the incomplete pictures task, the Pavlovian conditioning, the mirror task, also shown nga functional pa yung long-term memory. So HF's case really a very significant contribution to the advancement in the study of memory. But you cannot also deny HM's personal tragedy. So it was also a very unfortunate case for him. And kana no, but nonetheless, it was a contribution to science. And however, kining minaani nga mga cases would not be repeated anymore because again, the quest for knowledge should not be at the expense no of humanity. So mauna ni ang two distinct categories of long-term memory. So you have explicit memories and implicit memory. So when you say explicit memory, it is conscious, no, long-term memory. So meaning, if may recall kaani nila na siya conscious effort. So may involve sa conscious recollection of these memories. But sa implicit memory, usually unconscious, no, effortless recall. So long-term memories that are demonstrated by improved test performance without conscious awareness. So kato mga example kay of course kato mga gipang take ni HM. For example, kanang driving lessons. So recall a time when nag-driving lessons ka or describe a moment in your life, narrate it nga driving lessons ka. Diba? So that involves conscious recall. So that can be classified as an explicit memory. Okay? But the improved driving skill as a result of the lesson or the driving lesson is an example of implicit memory. So if we apply driving siguro to HM's case, maka-recall, dili siya ka-recall no nga nagkat-on siya og drive. So pangutanon siya, nag-driving lessons ka before? So dili ko kahinumdum. Pero yang driving skill ni improve siya. Okay, because of the driving lesson. The only difference is that di lang gid siya ka-recall, di siya kahinumdum nga nag-driving lessons sa. Pero ni-improve yang driving skill. So in other words, ma-affected most likely ang explicit memory. Pero yung implicit memory kay intact pa. Okay, so usually ang kaning implicit memories is non-verbal man na siya. So you have kana magbike ka or magluto, kanon mga procedural memory. Siguro if you're good at sports and then an accident happened and maybe bisag nag-amnesia ka pero kibawag yapon ka, you are still adept in that specific sport, no? So that involves implicit memory. Again, explicit, kailangan siya conscious recall, no, effortful recall. So kung na magtuon mo during a test, if you recall what concept is this, that's explicit memory. Usually events, masad ni siya events. So what happened during, if you're asked what happened during or when USC announced that classes will be suspended on March 16, 2020. So where were you at that time? So that's an explicit memory. Implicit memories again are unconscious, no? usually procedural memories. So this diagram shows a kanang organization of the long-term memory. So again, implicit, unconscious retrieval, explicit is conscious, implicit is mostly nonverbal, and verbal for explicit. Okay, so procedural for implicit, so learned skills and tasks, and explicit memory, declarative, events or facts. Semantic, meaning general knowledge of the world. So, for example, what's the tallest building? What's the speed of light? No, so that's semantic information. It's episodic sad kay kaning recall of personal events. So when the 2013 earthquake, we were struck by the 7.1 magnitude earthquake. What happened during that time? Where were you? Asa ka usab gibuhat, diba? So that's episodic memory. So dili ka recall si kwan ani, si HM ani, explicit. So yang mahinumduman is implicit, mga nonverbal, mga procedural skills, and emotionally and somatically based memories. So the condition is called the medial temporal lobe amnesia. So muna ang condition ni HM. So difficulty in forming explicit long-term memories while retaining the ability to form implicit long-term memories of the same experiences. Again, dili siya aware, no? Dili siya ka-recall nga if nagkat-on ba siya ana, but maka-learn siya. Di lang siya kahibaw, o di lang siya ka-recall, kano siya ga-learn, or paon siya sa nag-learn. Naka-learn lang siya implicitly. Ba? So at this part of his long-term memory. People with medial rather, temporal lobe amnesia have particular difficulty with episodic memory. So katong episodic memories are also called autobiographical memories. So when you are asked to narrate your life, what happened, where were you, what's the event happening, and so on. So kana maglisod si HM ana. Patients who have experienced cerebral ischemia, that is, have experienced an interruption of blood supply to their brains, often suffer from the medial temporal lobe. So, as what you have learned in the previous chapter, ischemia kanang klase siyang stroke, no? When the blood supply is disrupted, and it actually affects the medial temporal lobe. Ato part tapit sa hippocampus. So later on ato na explain asa gyud is exactly which part of the hippocampus or area around the hippocampus would be affected if magka-stroke. This is another example, no, sa to further elucidate pag yun, what is meant by the medial temporal lobe amnesia. So again, people with this condition have particular difficulty with episodic memories. So explicit memories have napagid siya components called episodic and semantic memory. When say semantic memory, facts. So kana no examples that Paris is the capital of France. France, lions and tigers are mammals. Um, this is Mount Everest is the tallest, is the highest peak on Earth, and so on. Okay. Episodic memory, again, this is also referred to as autobiographical memory. For example, I had a salad for lunch today. I graduated from college in 1994. I describe what happened in your graduation. What did you do? And so on. And I drove to the mall an hour ago and parked my car on the west side. So specific details on events of your life. So that's episodic memory. Okay. And people with medial temporal lobe amnesia have difficulty in episodic memory. So pwede sila makaremember sila pag yun og semantic memory. So kibaw sila nga Paris is the capital of France, Manila is the capital of the Philippines, who is the current president, no? Those are facts man. So maka-recall sila ana. So they have difficulty remembering specific events, okay, in their lives, but their memory for general information is normal. Okay. So basically if muskwila na sila, 'di ba? And the school, for example, in this subject, 'di ba, I'm teaching information or facts about memory. Okay? So ma-store na nila. So kibaw sila nga hippocampus is responsible for memory, but the specific event paunsa na sila nakatun ana is di sila ka-recall. Okay? So for example, although they can't remember having lunch, going to a movie, or chatting with a friend, or di sila ka-remember nga nag-attend sila lecture, pero maka-remember sila what their friends are like, a movie they have seen, maka-remember sila sa language nga nakatunan, okay? And other sorts of things nga ilang na-learn sa school. Okay? So inana no, inana ang characteristic of a person with medial temporal lobe amnesia. Okay, so let's move on to another type of amnesia, particularly amnesia of Korsakoff's syndrome. So Korsakoff's syndrome is a disorder of memory that is common in people who have consumed large amounts of alcohol. So in this type of amnesia, during the early stages of the disorder, anterograde amnesia for explicit episodic memories is the most prominent symptom. So similar, no? Similar with the medial temporal lobe amnesia, but early stage pa lang ni siya for at least for the amnesia relating to Korsakoff's syndrome. So as the disorder progresses, severe retrograde amnesia. So hasta day ang mga memories from the past, no, which can extend even back into childhood, also develops. So arguably worse siya, no? Worse siya sa medial temporal lobe. Kay hasta ang you cannot form new memories. Anterograde is more specifically episodic memories. And later on, if mo progress na ang disease, hasta ang remote memory or memories from the distant past. So what are the specific brain areas responsible for amnesia of the Korsakoff syndrome? So here, lesions in the medial diencephalon. So again, the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So in this picture, this is the diencephalon drilling apart. No? So you have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So lesions in the medial diencephalon. So medial thalamus and also medial hypothalamus. And it also diffuses to the neocortex. So when you say diffuses, it spreads. Okay? So from here, mo spread siya sa neocortex. This is the neocortex. The cerebral cortex is also referred to as the neocortex. Again, based on the past lessons, neocortex siya because this part of the brain later emerged. No? Katong nang gawas na ang primates, when the primates came into the scene, diha po ni-develop ang cortex. That's why it's neocortex. And also to the hippocampus and the cerebellum. So mo spread siya. So starting from the lesions in the medial diencephalon to the cortex, to the hippocampus, and to the cerebellum. So mo spread siya. Particularly damage in the mediodorsal nuclei of the thalamus. So this is a closer picture of the thalamus, and this is the dorsal nuclei, and specifically medial. So kaning part dire, muni ang damage. Hence, it is called medial diencephalic amnesia, or amnesia such as the Korsakoff's amnesia associated with damage to the medial diencephalon. So kindly remember, no, this kind of types of amnesia. So you have medial temporal lobe amnesia, you have medial diencephalic amnesia. Okay, from the name itself, diencephalic meaning medial, hypothalamus, and thalamus. There is also amnesia relating to Alzheimer's disease. This is more general than those associated with the medial temporal lobe damage, the medial diencephalic damage, or the Korsakoff syndrome. So this displays deficits in short-term memory and in some types of implicit memory. Diba kay, as what we have discussed previously, those two, the medial temporal and medial diencephalic, episodic memories mostly, diba? And ang implicit intact. And also their short-term memory, okay pa. But for amnesia relating to Alzheimer's disease, has ang short-term memory affected, and also some types no, of implicit memory, some procedural memory. So they really need help. This people or Alzheimer patients need significant help from other people compared to other forms of amnesia. So what brain structures are responsible for amnesia of the Alzheimer's disease? So the level of acetylcholine, so this is a neurotransmitter. Okay, this is greatly reduced in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. The degeneration of the basal forebrain. So this is the basal forebrain here. So this is the origin of acetylcholine and GABA pathways for the cortex. So low levels, no? Low levels of acetylcholine. Strokes in the basal forebrain, okay, strokes aning area can cause amnesia, led to the view that acetylcholine depletion is the cause of Alzheimer's disease. However, this is a very murag only one-dimensional view of cause. There are still many areas involved in the amnesia of Alzheimer's disease. So including the medial temporal lobe, you also have the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is for planning, organizing, evaluating behavior, okay, and it diffuses to other areas of the brain. Okay, so, diba, it's more general and mas worse siya compared sa previous tong atong na-discuss. There are also amnesia after concussions. So again, concussions, as what you have learned in the previous chapter, this results from a blow to the head, but there are no obvious or observable damage in the structures of the brain. Nonetheless, there are still effects such as confusion. No? So amnesia following a non-penetrating blow to the head or a concussion, um, it's called a post-traumatic amnesia or PTA. So how does this work? Okay, so in this picture, let's just say the blow to the head is a punch, no, a punch to the face or a punch in the head. Okay, so first is a blow to the head produces coma. So when we say coma, that's a pathological loss of consciousness. Okay, so from the normal cognitive function, katong wala pa siya na subagan or wala pa siya napakong. Okay, so and then the blow to the head, after that it produces a coma. So a coma could, depending on the intensity sa pagka igo sa ulo, it could last several minutes or even days or weeks, and severe na good in severe cases. However, napoy times nga ano lang, kaniyot ra or minutes lang and so on. And when the victim regains consciousness, okay, there is a period of confusion. So after the coma, confusion, or night times nga disoriented, no, after makamata siya from the coma, night time or night period nga confused, no, confused kaayo or in a state of confusion ang patient. So when the period of confusion ends, the victim has retrograde amnesia. Again, when we say retrograde amnesia, makalimot siya sa mga memories formed before the incident. So the incident here is a blow to the head. So makalimot siya sa events that led to the incident, which is blowing to the head. But dili kay na siya wide-spanning retrograde amnesia nga hasta childhood makalimtan o dili. Just a very little period, no, a period occurring just before the blow to the head in ana. So meaning di kay siya ka-recall ano na pa kung siya or what causes the blow to the head. And okay, the victim has retrograde amnesia for events that occurred during the period, okay, just before the blow. And anterograde amnesia, again makalimot siya sa he is unable to form new memories for events that occurred during the period of confusion. So during a stage, okay. For example, nakamata na ang person sa coma, and then siya sa hospital, and then nakig-istorya siya while in the state of confusion. nagka-istorya siya sa iyang family members. Okay? And since okay pa man ang short-term memory, so maka-carry on siya og conversation. But after the stage of confusion, when the normal cognitive function goes back, makalimot siya nga nakig-converse din siya sa iyang family members at the hospital. Okay? So, muna siya ang implications for anterograde amnesia. But of course, sa kanira ni nga stage, no? Dili siya kanang, unlike the amnesia for Korsakoff's, for the medial temporal lobe, wide spanning ang retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. But sa kini lang, for effects sa concussion is ano lang, a little bit or just before, no, just before the blow to the head, so di siya ka-recall sa events that causing the blow to the head, and atong time nga confused pa siya. So once the confusion ends, mabalik na ang normal cognitive function. Gradients of retrograde amnesia and memory consolidation. So unsa may pasabot aning memory consolidation? So this is defined as a time-dependent process by which recent learned experiences are transformed into long-term memory, okay? Presumably by structural and chemical changes in the nervous system. So for example, the strengthening of the synaptic connections between neurons. So memory is consolidated when new experiences, no, the process of transferring new experiences from short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay? So to find out, so unsa man kadugaya or what's the span and of time it takes for short-term memory to be converted or to be transformed into long-term memory. So to study that, they have used electroconvulsive shocks or ECS. So this is an intense, brief, diffuse, seizure-inducing current that is administered to the brain through large electrodes attached to the scalp. So what's the rationale no nga or rationale nga ilan ning gihimo ang ECS to study memory consolidation? Okay, according to the researchers involved, by disrupting the neural activity, ECS would erase from storage only those memories that had not yet been converted to the structural synaptic changes. And the length of the period of retrograde amnesia produced by an ECS would thus provide an estimate of the amount of time needed for memory consolidation. Okay, so to further elucidate unsay pasabot aning the length of period of retrograde amnesia, so let's discuss this example, no, or the test that was used by the researchers involved. So mo na ni ang test nga gigamit nila no for kanang memory consolidation. So they were using rats. Well, as you can observe, when we study memory, when the researchers on neuropsychology study memory, gigamit yun is animals because again it's unethical man because studying the brain involves kind of creating lesions and then if na lesion diri nga part, so which behavior would most likely be affected, but and it's very unethical to use humans, no nga imuhang i-damage ang brain sa human and then tan-aw na to unsay effect ana niya, di ba? So mo nang nigamit gyud og mostly gamit animals, okay? So in this study, thirsty rats were placed for 10 minutes on each of the 5 consecutive days in a test box that contained a small niche. Okay, so let's just say this is the test box. This is not the actual kuan yun ha, box nga gigamit. So I've just used this for representation lang. Okay. So again, thirsty rats were placed in this for 10 minutes, no? For 5 days, 5 consecutive days. Then ay small niche. Let's just say kini nga red object here, muni ang niche. And by the 5th of these habituation sessions, most rats explore the niche, okay, only 1 or 2 times per session. So for 10 minutes, ni explore sila diri nga area or gi-explore nila ni nga niche just 1 or 2 times per session. The next day, on the 6th day, a water spout was placed in the niche. So gibutakan ni siya tubig. And remember, the rats are thirsty. Okay? And each rat was allowed to drink for 15 seconds after it discovered the spout. So this was the learning trial. And then 10 seconds after, okay, 1 minute after, or 10 minutes after, or 1 hour after, or 3 hours later, each rat received a single shock. Okay, so remember nga on the sixth day, gibutangan na ni siya tubig. Okay? And then after ato nga learning, sumoto ang learning trial. So after ato nga trial, gi-administeran sila og ECS or the shocks after 10 seconds. So meaning 10 seconds after the trial, 1 minute, 10 minutes, 1 hour, or 3 hours later after the trial. So gitagaan sila og electric shocks. And then the next day, the retention of all subjects was assessed on the basis of how many times each explored the niche when the water spout was not present. Again, di ba, remember nga gitagaan ang rats og learning trial, di ba? Gibutangan og tubig ilahang niche and then gipainom sila dito for about 15 seconds nga duration. The control rats, when you say control rats, mo ni sila ang rats nga gihapon gitagaan og learning trial, gibutangan og tubig ang niche, then for a duration of 15 seconds they're allowed to drink the water. But they did not or they were not administered the electric shocks. Okay? So muna ang pasabot sa control rats. So naagapon sila learning trial, gipainom gyapon og tubig, but they were not administered the electric shocks. So katupong rats nga gitagaan og learning trial, nga gitagaan pa jud og electric shocks, we call them the experimental rats. Okay? So iba basic knowledge on experimental psych. So you have controlled conditions and the experimental conditions. Say experimental condition, mutoy gitagaan og treatment, and the treatment here is the electric shocks. Okay, so the control rats explore the empty niche an average of 10 times during the 10-minute test session, thereby indicating that they remembered their discovery of water the previous day. Diba kay katong wala pa sila tagaig tubig, on average 1 or 2 times lang mo explore sa niche. But after gibutangan og tubig ang niche, mo explore na sila dito an average of 10 times during the 10-minute period. So thereby it goes to show nga naa sila memory, okay, of the learning trial. The rats that have received the ECS, katong mga experimental rats, 1 hour or 3 hours after the learning trial, also explore the niche about 10 times. So katong mga rats, take note sa time, katong gi-administeran og shocks 1 hour after the trial or 3 hours after the trial, nakahinumdom gyapon sila. Meaning wala na wala, okay? So the shocks did not affect the memory, okay, the learning. However, the rats that have received the seconds, 1 minute or 10 minutes after the ECS, wala ra ng 10, the learning trial explore the empty niche significantly less on the test day. So dili compared sa control condition and katong rats nga gi-administeran og shocks 1 or 3 hours later, nakalimot ang mga rats nga gi-administeran og shocks after 1 minute or 10 minutes or seconds ra. Okay, so this goes to show nga ma-form ang memory consolidation for around between 10 minutes and 1 hour. So this graph shows the results of the study. Okay, so in the y-axis, this is the mean, the dependent variable, the mean niche exploration. So how many times did they explore the niche? And in the y-axis, you muna ang time, okay, the time intervals in the learning trial. So as you can see in the yellow, you have, these are control groups. So kining this one here, no learning control group, meaning mo ni ang group of rats nga wala pa im na og water and at the same time wala pod gi-administer og electric shocks. And the learning but no ECS control group, so gitagaan sila atong learning trial, which is the niche was gibutangan og water and then they were allowed to drink, but they wala gi-administeran og electric shocks. So mo ni atong basis. So on average dapat siya 10 times no ma-explore ang learning group nga rats on sa niche. And then as you can see here, those rats, those experimental rats nga were administered shocks 10 seconds, 1 minute, and 10 minutes after, diba? Significantly different, or significantly different from the 10 from the control group. So this goes to show nga kining nga groups of rats dire, kining 3 sets of times, nakalimot sila, no? So ni-develop sila og retrograde amnesia. So meaning wala na store, or wala na store enough ang learning trial. However, the rats that were administered ECS after 1 hour or 3 hours after learning trial, they still retain. Diba? So not significantly different from the control group. So in other words, wala ara sila ni develop og retrograde amnesia. So they still remember what they have learned. Okay? So based on, as a result, the consolidation of the memory of learning trial took between 10 minutes and 1 hour. So mo ni ang length of time it takes for memory to be consolidated, or for memory to be transformed from short-term memory to long-term memory. So around 10 minutes and 1 hour. So this is called Hebb's theory of memory consolidation. So Hebb argued that memories of experiences are stored in the short term by neural activity reverberating in closed circuits. When you say reverberating, circulating, no, in circuits, these reverberating patterns of neural activity are susceptible to disruption, but eventually they induce changes in the involved synapses, which provide stable long-term storage. So ang disruption na gigamit sa experiment is of course the ECS, and how long is that eventually? It's around 10 minutes to 1 hour. So synaptic, or the synapse, will develop connections, no, from each other, mo strengthen ang connection, thereby storing it in long-term memory. And the time it takes is around 10 minutes, between 10 minutes and 1 hour. But as you will learn later on, napoy opposing studies no nga dili man 10 minutes to 1 hour, but pwede nga longer pa yun, okay? So this is now the other test, no, involving memory consolidation. Squire, Slater, and Chase 1975 measured the memory of a group of ECS-treated patients for television shows that had played for only one season in different years prior to their electroconvulsive therapy. So muni ang graph sa ilang results. So the y-axis here again refers to memory, and it is operationally defined as the percent of TV show titles correctly recognized. And kining x-axis is the number of years before ECS that one season TV show was played. Okay, so for example, kining 1 to 3 years, meaning this TV show was shown 3 years ago, or this TV show was shown 4 to 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, and so on. Okay, and if you notice, there are two colors now of the graphs. So one in violet, another is in yellow or gold. Okay, so at the first trial, at the pre-test, no, ang kining violet is the test given before the shock, or the electroconvulsive shocks. So in for TV shows that have shown, or that has showed 1 year ago or 3 years ago, 65, meaning the patients could identify 65 correctly, or correct titles. And after the ECS, diba, they can only now recognize 40. Diba? So that's a really big, no, difference from 65 to 40. And take note that this is applicable for TV shows that showed that has been shown 3 years ago already, diba? So this is quite contradictory to what Hebb's theory of memory consolidation, diba? Kay before, in the rat experiment, 10 to 1 hour lang daw ma-store na siya. But in the results of the study, even bisag 1 year ago na to siya gi-show nga TV show, 1 to 3 years ago na, nganong ni-decline maghapon, nganong nakalimot maghapon sila, diba? But kining mga 4 to 5 years ago, 6, 7 years, dili na observable ang difference, right? So around 1 to 3 years lang observable ang difference. So this shows that long gradients of retrograde amnesia are incompatible with Hebb's theory of consolidation. Okay, ingon si Hebb's about 10 minutes to 1 hour, and then, di ba, ma-form na siya sa long-term memory. But the results here have shown otherwise because TV shows that have from 3 years ago, kalimtan gihapon, di ba? Based on the results. So this implies that long gradients of retrograde amnesia indicate that memory consolidation can continue for a very long time, even after learning, or perhaps indefinitely. So dili kita, based on this study, wala gi exact time when is memory, or when the experiences in the short-term memory can be transformed in the long-term memory. So the process might take a very long time, no, perhaps um, an unidentified number of years. Okay. The hippocampus and some related structures play a role in memory consolidation. So that memories are temporarily stored in the hippocampus until they can be transferred to a more stable cortical storage system. So we call this the standard consolidation theory. And multiple trace theory, so these are theories now of memory consolidation. Multiple trace theory states that retained memories become progressively more resistant to disruption by hippocampal damage because each time a similar experience occurs, the original memory is recalled and a new engram, or a change in the brain that stores a memory, is established and linked to the original engram, making the memory easier to recall and the difficult engram more difficult to disrupt. So as time passes by, no, especially if gigamit ni siya nga certain information or memory, then synaptic connections will be strengthened. So that's according to the multiple trace theory. Okay, so now let's go to some models using animals in studying amnesia or memory. Diba? As what I have mentioned a while ago, studying on memory really involves kind of animals because it's unethical to do it on humans. And for this particular model, the monkey model, ilang gi try to convert katong, if you remember HM's case on the medial temporal amnesia. So nihimo sila animal model no sa iyahang so structure sa iyahang brain. Okay, and then they identify dito asa gyud nga parts ang affected uh, during the medial temporal amnesia. Okay, so in this monkey model of object recognition, when we say object recognition, that's our ability to perceive an object's physical properties, like, for example, yung shape, yung color, yung texture, and also apply meanings to this object. Meaning, unsay gamit aning object, um, the previous experience with the object, and how it relates to other objects, and so on. So that's object recognition. So we call this test the delayed non-matching sample test. So ang buhaton ani, okay, the monkey moves the sample object to obtain food from the well beneath it. So this is the sample object ang gigunitan sa monkey niya. Yan ang i-move na ay food sa ubos. Ang second, na-delay. So a screen is lowered in front of the monkey during the delay period. Okay, so depende na pila ka minutes or pila ka hours ang delay. And then the third, ablihan og balik, the monkey is confronted with the sample object and an unfamiliar object. So yung buhaton dapat makahinumdum siya, no, sa sample object, di ba? Mo man yung ganina. Then na ay new, no, new unfamiliar object. The monkey must remember the sample object, so yan ang hinumduman, and then select the unfamiliar object to obtain the food beneath it. So muni ang task, muni ang delayed non-matching to sample test. Okay, so this is now the graph of the results of the experiment using monkeys. So again, ilang ning kanang replicate no, or kanang nahimo sila animal models sa brain structure sa case ni HM. Okay? And then they used monkeys. So ilang gibuhat is moto ni administer pod sila og medial temporal lobe lesions sa monkeys, which reflects the case of HM sa iyang surgery. Okay, so monkeys ilang gigamit. And this is the results, no? The y-axis here is the percent correct. Okay, katong, di ba, if you can remember the task, and muni ang delay, katong time magisradaan tong um, window. So after an 8-second delay, 15-second delay, 1 minute nga delay, and 10 minutes delay. So as you can see, there were significant deficits at all, but except sa shortest retention interval. So kung 8 seconds lang gisrad, ang dili kay mo differ. But after 8 seconds, diba, significantly different. This is the graph for the normal control. This is the control sa katong naay medial temporal lobe lesions, diba? So they are significantly different. So these deficits parallel the memory deficits of humans with medial temporal lobe amnesia on the same task, now, just like HM's case. So this is now the structures in the medial temporal lobe. Again, you have the hippocampus, this part here, okay, hippocampus, the amygdala, the green part, and the rhinal cortex. Diba? In the earlier part of the lecture video, I always say hippocampus plus amygdala and an adjacent cortex. So this is now the name of the adjacent cortex. It's called the rhinal cortex. So kining tulo ang responsible for medial temporal lobe amnesia. Okay, so diba, we have learned siguro previously that the hippocampus is really the major kanang role, no, and has a major part in memory. However, daghag pag-area sa brain ang contributor sa memory sa usa ka tawo. So in this case, na appeal pud ang amygdala, appeal pud ang rhinal cortex. So it's not really helpful to see the brain as a separate functional units, no? Dili siya inana, like dili siya, dapat di ta moingon nga kung vision gani dapat occipital lobe ra gyud, or kung memory dapat sa hippocampus ra gyud, and so on, di ba? But the functions are actually diffused. So different areas of the brain contribute to the same function. So we do not view it as functional units. So again, remember, no, the three main components of the medial temporal lobe. So the rhinal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And these three play a significant part to amnesia in the medial temporal lobes. Neuroanatomical basis of the object recognition deficits resulting from medial temporal lobectomy. So this is again the katong surgery ni HM, no? So based on their studies and the previous slide, katong monkey test, the relation between ischemia-produced hippocampal damage. So muna if ma-stroke ka, if there's a disruption in your blood flow, usually it results in medial temporal lobe amnesia. So ischemia mo produce usually og medial temporal lobe amnesia. Okay, and the relation between the ischemia-produced hippocampal damage and object recognition deficits in humans, monkeys, or rats seem to provide a strong support for the theory that hippocampus is responsible for object recognition memory, or it plays a key role in object recognition memory. However, some confusions arise and some questions that said, for example, how can ischemia-produced lesions to one small part of the hippocampus be associated with severe deficits in the performance on the delayed non-matching to sample test? If you can recall this test, katong monkey test, katong na-delay na ay sample objects, no? When the deficits associated with the total removal of the hippocampus are only slight. So ni-argue sila nga, di ba, again, if ma-stroke ka as ischemia-produced lesions, usually mo experience ang tao og medial temporal lobe amnesia. And then they provided a theory nga it's because of the hippocampal damage. Pero nga naman nga sa gamay ra kay damage sa hippocampus, severe deficits, okay? Pero if kwaon ang hippocampus, nganong slight deficit raman sa object recognition memory. So of course they have tried to answer that, and they hypothesize that first, the ischemia produced hyperactivity of the CA1 pyramidal cells. By the way, kining pyramidal cells, parts ni sila, no? Major components na sila sa hippocampus. So, kini siya, muni ang hippocampus, and then, na yung mga subfields. So, ang green, the CA1, CA2 subfield, and so on, up to CA4. So, muna sila ang major components of the hippocampus. So, the ischemia produced hyperactivity sa CA1 nga portion of the hippocampus damages neurons outside the hippocampus. Diba kay ningon sila nga nganong if small part of the hippocampus is damaged, grabe man o deficit. But if faon ang hippocampus, anong gamay ra mag-deficit in terms of object recognition nga memory. So their first hypothesis is kana, no? It's not really of the hippocampus per se, but maybe neurons outside or around the area of the hippocampus. Second, this extra hippocampal damage is not readily detectable by conventional histological analysis. So maybe the methods they used is not enough to detect, no, the damage surrounding the hippocampus. So that's their second hypothesis nga wala na bantayan dayon. Third, this extra hippocampal damage is largely responsible for the object recognition deficits that are produced by cerebral ischemia. So, meaning dili gid ang hippocampus ang responsible for object recognition, but it may be because of some outside, no, extra hippocampal nga area in the brain. So, the most obvious damage following cerebral ischemia is in the CA subfield. Okay, so following a stroke, following a disruption in the blood, ang damage is in the CA1 subfield, this area getting green. Okay? But there is substantial damage to also other areas that is more diffuse, okay, mas spread pa, and this more difficult to quantify. So maybe mas spread siya laing area sa brain, so outside the hippocampus, no? And then the potential here is that those outside the hippocampus affected might be responsible for object recognition. So, unsa man nga mga areas ang responsible for object recognition. So, going back again to this picture, no, di ba, an adjacent cortex to the hippocampus is the rhinal cortex. Okay, so kaning blue part here. Okay, so in this picture, the rhinal cortex, kay kini sila, no? Okay, so the rhinal cortex comprises two areas. The entorhinal cortex, here kining yellow, entorhinal cortex, so the cortex within the rhinal fissure, and the perirhinal cortex, the cortex around the rhinal fissure, so perirhinal cortex. So, and if you can, this is the hippocampus here. So, adjacent to the hippocampus is the rhinal cortex. So, muni ang madamage, di ba? Sa CA1 subfield sa hippocampus, dito nga part, mo spread siya outside ang damage. And ang maigo is kaning rhinal cortex. The perirhinal cortex plays a role in object recognition. So specifically this one, no? To construct and maintain complex representation of objects that are used in a variety of processes. So for example, perception nato, categorization, in addition to memory. So in other words, dili the hippocampus ang responsible for object recognition memory problems, but it's because of the perirhinal cortex, so the adjacent cortex. So mo ning explanation nganong bisag gamay ra nga part sa hippocampus ang damage, or if kaon ang hippocampus, gamay ra kayo kanang sana, no, wala kayo deficit in terms of objective memory. It's because if ma-diffuse ang damage, ang ma-affected is ang perirhinal cortex, and the perirhinal cortex plays a significant role in object recognition. So kindly remember, no, this information. So what type of memory man di ay is hippocampus most likely associated with? So it's for spatial location. So that discovery led to a re-evaluation of the contributions of the hippocampus to memory, which has focused on the substantial evidence implicating the hippocampus in memory for spatial location. So, dili sa object recognition, but more on spatial relations or location. When you say spatial memory, this enables an organism to acquire a mental representation about spatial layouts in the environment and to navigate effectively in that environment. So this allows one to remember where an object is in relation to another object, for instance, allowing someone to navigate through a familiar city. So muna ang most likely associated function for hippocampus. So dili di siya object recognition. So application siguro of spatial memory kaning, for example, if your job is an architect ka or interior designer or photographer, kana I think useful ang spatial skills aning types of profession because it needs you have to be well oriented, no, with the relationships of the objects in one another. Because hippocampus is most likely associated with spatial locations, so naay place cells, no, inside the hippocampus. So place cells are neurons that respond only when a subject is in specific locations. For example, when a rat is first placed in an unfamiliar test environment, none of its hippocampal neurons have a placed field in that test environment. Okay, of course, bag-o pa man. Then, as the rat familiarizes itself with the environment, many hippocampal neurons acquire a place field in it. So that is, each fires only when the rat is in a particular part of the test environment. So that is how we become familiar, you know, with a place, with the relationship of the objects in that place. We are able to navigate ourselves in this place because we have formed place fields, you know, in the hippocampus, or place cells, no, are already formed specific connections. Hippocampus and the entorhinal grid cells. Grid cells are entorhinal neurons that each have an extensive array of evenly spaced place fields, producing a pattern reminiscent of a graph paper. Okay, it's a major source of neural signals to the hippocampus. And entorhinal grid cells respond relatively reflexively to location, whereas the hippocampal place cells respond to place in combination with other features of the test environment. So remember, no, ang mga cells associated with the hippocampus. So you have place cells and you also have grid cells or entorhinal grid cells. Theories of hippocampal function. So we have the cognitive map theory. So this states that there are several systems in the brain that specialize in the memory for different kinds of information. And the specialization of the hippocampus is the memory for spatial location. So again, this goes to show nga diffuse, no, ang different functions or different types of memories kay is also diffused, or ang ihang functions kay in different areas of the brain. So dili siya like single functional units. The hippocampus also constructs and maintains allocentric maps of the external world from the sensory input that it receives. So allocentric meaning representations of space based on relations among external objects and landmarks. So murag mahimo siya schema, mental schema of our external environment. Ang function sa hippocampus. It also plays a role in episodic memory or autobiographical memory, because spatial context plays a critical role in acquiring and recalling the memory of any episode. Okay. So the hippocampus is a large complex structure and thus unlikely to act as a unit with a single function. So lahi-lahi gyapon siya, no? So, and still, despite nga daghan significant researches on memory, the functions of each part of the hippocampus is still needed to be addressed. So unsa pa may laing areas, or unsa pa may responsible, or unsa pa may specific function that is accounted for the specific areas in the hippocampus. Where are memories stored? So far we have discussed four neural structures that is related to memory storage. Is first, you have the hippocampus, the perirhinal cortex, the mediodorsal nucleus, and the basal forebrain. So again, the hippocampus is accounted for, or is most likely associated with spatial memory. So the hippocampus is in this area, kani siya. Okay, spatial memory. Muhimo siya mental schema or cognitive map of the external environment. So again, when we say spatial memory, this is the storage and retrieval of information that is needed both to, for example, plan a route to a desired location, to remember where an object is located, or where an event occurred. That's why important siya for episodic memories. Next is the perirhinal cortex. Diba? If you can recall, perirhinal cortex is responsible for object recognition. Okay? Diba, muni ang part nga ma-damage, diba? If there's a cerebral ischemia, and then ang CA1 part sa hippocampus, muna siya ang mostly ma-damage, that little part of the hippocampus, and then it diffuses to its neighboring areas, which is the rhinal cortex, and more specifically, the perirhinal cortex, and it is responsible for object recognition. So we say object recognition, that's the ability to perceive an object's physical properties. So yung shape, ang color, ang texture, and also apply attributes to it. So unsa may gamit ani nga object, how does it relate with other objects, what are your previous experiences with this object. So that is what object recognition is. So in the picture, it's located here, getting perirhinal cortex. So entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus, the amygdala. And we also have discussed the mediodorsal nucleus. So as what we have learned in amnesia relating to Korsakoff's syndrome. So mediodorsal nucleus man to ang medyo damaged nga part. So in this area here, okay, so the medial dorsal nucleus, and the thalamus is located here. The thalamus and the hypothalamus comprises the diencephalon, and damage here would most likely result to medial diencephalic amnesia, which is related to, again, the Korsakoff's amnesia. You also have the basal forebrain. If you can recall, this is related to amnesia amnesia of the Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so there's reduced or low levels of acetylcholine. So that's what is believed to be causing amnesia brought by Alzheimer's disease. So remember that there is no single brain structure responsible for memory storage. Okay, so again, do not view the brain as single functional units. Second, memories are stored diffusely in the brain and thus can survive destruction of any single structure. Diba? So meaning spread, spread ang memory sa brain. Dili lang kay sa hippocampus lang alone, sa basal forebrain lang alone, but diffused siya. So many areas in the brain are responsible for memory. And memories become more resistant to disruption over time. Aside from the 4 that was mentioned in relation to memory storage, there are also other structures responsible. For example, the inferotemporal cortex. So this cortex is the inferior, the cortex of the inferior temporal lobe. And it is involved in visual perception of objects and is thought to participate in concert with the perirhinal cortex. The perirhinal cortex is for, again, object recognition in storing memories of visual patterns. So this is the inferotemporal cortex. Diba? As you have noticed or you have learned before, the temporal lobe is most likely associated with auditory information, right? Kaya naman diha ang auditory cortex and the auditory association area. But for the inferotemporal cortex, pwede po siya mo store of visual patterns, and visual information is most likely associated in the occipital lobe. Okay, and so this just further goes to show na, again, the brain is not really a single functional unit, and different types of memories are stored diffusely, in different parts of the brain. So dili siya exclusive. Kay temporal lobe, auditory lang alone, occipital lobe, visual lang alone, so it's not the case. So kani, for example, inferotemporal cortex, but responsible for visual patterns. Another is the amygdala. So as what you have learned, in the case of HM, the medial temporal lobe amnesia, ang parts of the medial temporal lobe, we have amygdala, the hippocampus, and the rhinal cortex. The amygdala is thought to play a special role in memory for emotional significance of experiences. Okay, for example, there's a study involving rats. So rats with lesions do not respond to fear, to a neutral stimulus that has previously been followed by an electric shock. A patient who has a bilateral damage to the amygdala could not acquire conditioned autonomic startle responses to various visual or auditory stimuli. But there is little evidence that the amygdala stores memories. Ang iyalang function is mainly, it appears kanino to be involved in strengthening emotionally significant memories stored in other structure. Okay, so especially katong mga memories nga mo involve og intense emotion. And of course, intense emotions involve most likely fear, diba? So maybe if you try to recall what happened during the time, for example, when I think it was in 2013 when the 7.1 earthquake struck in Cebu. So where were you at that time? What were you doing? So for sure, even though that's a long time ago, you can still remember vividly what happened, what were you doing. So it's because of the amygdala, because it strengthens these memories that as high involves emotionally significant information. So why no? So ngano man nga kini mga emotional significant memories kay strengthen man or mas store man siya vividly. Okay? Again, because it's in an evolutionary perspective, it's essential for survival, right? So ang mga times nga hadlok ta or na threaten ta, muni mga high og emotional significance. So it is still vividly remembered in the brain, so that whenever we encounter these situations again, kibaw na to unsa atong i-react, di na to malimtan, because this particular memory is important in terms of our survival. Okay, so this involvement of the amygdala accounts for the fact that emotion-provoking events are remembered better than neutral events. Neutral events meaning kanang wala lang, a typical day, di ba? Usually di makakahinungdong sa mga gibuhat last week at the specific day, okay? But for emotionally provoking events, so na the whole kind chance nga you can still vividly remember it. The prefrontal cortex is also involved in the storage of memory. So two episodic memory abilities are often lost by patients with large prefrontal lesions. So by the way, prefrontal cortex is located in the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for planning, organization, decision making, and other complex cognitive functions. So prefrontal lesions often display both anterograde and retrograde deficits in memory for the temporal order of events, even when they can remember the events themselves. So in other words, can remember siya unsa ang event, but di siya ka organize unsay first nahitabo, unsay second nahitabo, and so on. And also deficits in working memory. So the working memory is the ability to maintain relevant memories while a task is being completed. Okay, so muni ang mga if nakay damage or lesion in the prefrontal cortex, you might have deficits in anterograde and retrograde memory as well as the working memory. So in this example here, a person who have damage in the prefrontal cortex. So the story of one patient with prefrontal cortex damage is very well known because she was the sister of Wilder Penfield, the famous Montreal neurosurgeon. Before her brain damage, she had been an excellent cook, and afterward, she retained all the requisite knowledge. She remembered her favorite recipes, and she also remembered how to perform each individual cooking technique. However, she was incapable of preparing even simple meals because she could not carry out the various steps in proper sequence. So that's an example of a patient with lesions or damage in the prefrontal cortex. So this is where the prefrontal cortex is located, this area here. Okay, so some regions of the prefrontal cortex perform, again, as what I've mentioned, complex cognitive functions, attention, decision making, task management during working memory. The cerebellum and the striatum is also responsible for memory storage. So, kini nga structure here, this one. So this is the cerebellum and ang striatum kini. So you have learned that the cerebellum is associated with balance and coordination. And it is also thought to participate in the storage of memories of learned sensory motor skills, no, through its various neuroplastic mechanisms. So example, classical conditioning. So when we are classically conditioned, it is stored in the cerebellum. For example, you have taste aversion. Diba? Taste aversion is a product of classical conditioning. So your aversion of certain foods is, if it's classical conditioned, and then it's stored in the cerebellum. The air puff experiment, katong hoypon imuhang mata, there's a tone, there's a sound, and then hoypon imong mata sa experimenter, and then mo blink ka. So since pwede man ma-pair ang sound sa air puff, sa sound pa lang, sa tone pa lang mo blink na ka. So that skill or that reaction is stored in the cerebellum. No, so dili lang po siya for balance and coordination, but also for sensory motor skills. The striatum said is thought to store memories for consistent relationships between stimuli and responses, the type of memories that develop incrementally over many trials. In other words, habit formation. So kani ato mga habits, it is stored in the striatum. So if habit na nimo, for example, mag-exercise every morning or every afternoon, habit na nimo mag-pray every morning or mag-pray every day, or habit nimo mo eat og healthy foods. So this is stored in the striatum. So those are some of the structures involved in memory storage. So in this part of the discussion, we will be talking about the synaptic mechanism. So we'll talk now about the chemicals involved in creating and storing these memories. You have to review, or you have to have the basic knowledge in neural conduction and synaptic transmission to really understand the chemical process of memory formation. We have this concept called long-term potentiation. LTP is the main form of synaptic plasticity, reflecting the activity of synaptic information storage processes, and it has been identified as the prime candidate to be the cellular correlate of learning memory. In other words, LTP is a process of persistent strengthening of synapses. So muna maka-learn ka or maka-remember ka or ma-store na nga information because your synapses are being strengthened. And long-term potentiation is a study on some specific ions or elements nga ma-synthesize for that synapse will be strengthened. Okay, so that leads to a long-lasting increase in signal transmission between neurons. So basically, it's all about strengthening synapses. Okay, so that once ma-strengthen ang connection, mas dali na lang ang mas efficient na ang pagpasa sa electrical signals. Hence, you can recall or you can remember the information better. So there's a separate video discussing LTP and the process and the chemicals involved in LTP. So again, you have to have the basic knowledge on neural transmission and synaptic transmission in order to really fully understand the LTP. So again, view the video, the separate video in this module. So it's a very, very good explanation of LTP. Okay, conclusion, the biopsychology of memory and you. So all of us at some point in our life, we have experienced a memory loss or amnesia. Okay, so we refer to it as infantile amnesia. This is childhood amnesia, that is the inability of human adults to remember episodic experiences that occurred during the first few years of life, generally 0 to 3 years, and the tendency to have sparse recollection of episodic experiences that occurred before age 10. So possible reasons as to why we develop the infantile amnesia is the underdevelopment of the infant's brain, of an infant's brain. Diba kay, of course, when we are infant, di pa man na kompleto or dili pa man fully develop atong brain. So it might have implications on memory consolidation. So dili pa yan naka-efficient ma-transfer ang information from the short term to long-term memory. Or we might also have deficits in memory retrieval. And they found out that normal children who fail explicitly to recall or recognize things from their early childhood display preserved implicit memories for these findings. Okay, so this contention is because of this experiment. So Drummy and Newcomb used a version of the incomplete pictures test. So you have learned already what the incomplete pictures test is. Katong gitake ni HM sa first part of the discussion. They showed a series of drawings to 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds and also adults. And 3 months later, the researchers assessed the implicit memories for these drawings by asking each participant to identify them and some controlled drawings as quickly as they could. So they found out nga they still improved. So after many trials, na-improve tanan, no? Ang 3-year-olds, ang 5 and adults. So that goes to show nga na implicit memory. But if imong pangutan-on ang 3-year-olds nga, have you seen this picture before? Dili sila ka, like dili, no, they would say no, I cannot remember, or di sila hinundong seeing this picture before. But that is in contradictory with the results of their of the experiment or the result of the task, because na-improve man ilahang results, no? They made lesser errors as the trial progresses. So in other words, di lang sila ka explicitly recall, but na-preserve, no? Which is referred to as implicit memory. So they cannot explicitly recall, but they can still preserve their implicit memories. So does supplements or multivitamins that claims to improve memory effective? So for example, ginkgo biloba, you have ginseng, multivitamins, glucose, and many more. Okay, so we call them nootropics. So although nootropics are often marketed to healthy adults wanting to improve their memories, most research on it has been done with either non-humans, okay, or humans with memory difficulties. So we're not sure if it's really effective for adults, healthy adults, wanting to improve their memory. Next, the relevant research with humans tends to be of low quality, few participants, poor controls, little effort to differentiate among various kinds of memory. So in other words, dili rigorous ang method nga gigamit, no, when studying about these drugs claiming to improve memory. And there are also typically few positive findings and have been difficult to replicate. In short, no purported nootropic has been convincingly shown to have memory enhancing effects. Okay, so dili na siya significant. Even if you drink a drug, okay, there's no way of certainly telling if it's effective or not. Okay, so no evidence. Okay, no evidence that it has memory enhancing effects. So to end this discussion, here are 13 brain exercises to help keep you mentally sharp. This is actually from Healthline, and this is the website. And each brain exercise has a research, no, is based on an empirical study. And gilink ra nila dito sa website ang research articles for each brain exercise. Okay, so the first is having fun with jigsaw puzzles. Okay, number 2, trying your hand at cards, playing kanang solitaire baron, for example. Number 3, building your vocabulary. So it can be done through reading. Okay, you can read books. It could be educational books. It could also be books that are or novels or fan fictions or anything, any reading material that you're interested with. Dancing can also improve. Using all your senses. Learning a new skill. Maybe you want to learn how to cook. Learning how to drive. How ganahan ba karon makaton sa pagtahi or any other life skill. Okay. 7 is to teach a new skill to someone else. So based on the learning pyramid, teaching the method of teaching is actually very effective in terms of retention of information. Okay, if you just listen to lecture videos like this, the retention is significantly lesser. But if you learn by applying, for example, teaching this to someone else, teaching the information you learned in this chapter to your friends or to your classmates, or maybe engaging in group discussion, so kind of it would create, or it would lead to more retention. Listening or playing to music, or learning a new instrument, okay, taking a new route. So maybe, for example, if you are um, commuting from home to school, so siguro na ay times nga ma-explore ka, maglakaw ra ka, or magbike ra ka baron, for example. So dili ka mo take sa imong usual route. Or maybe you go to an adventure with nature siguro, go to the beach, to the mountain. Number 10, to meditate, okay? 11, learn a new language, okay? If you have the time, go ahead, because it um, promotes the creation of new synapses, new connections in the brain. 12, taking up Tai Chi. This is a form of martial arts. So, research dito, say, nag-state how can Tai Chi improve brain function. And 13 is to focus on another person, or empathizing other people, and so on. But also remember to do this in moderation. Not to the point nga you learn a new skill, then imong gidungan learning a new skill, learn pa jud kag language, learn pa jud kag new instrument. So, di ba, ang effect is, of course, stress. And it has been observed that prolonged stress would lead to mental health problems. So remember to do everything and moderation, and always use your brain. So tinuod yun ng phrase nga, use it or lose it. So if di mo gamit, sige gamit, then the synaptic connections will be pruned, or what di naman siya magamit, so more weaken ang connection. But those connections, or those information nga sige nimong balik-balik, sige nimo ni gina-practice, it will further the synaptic connections will further be strengthened. Thus, efficient ra kaayo ang pag-pass on sa electrical signals, which enables you to remember better. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of this discussion for this chapter. If you have any further clarifications or questions, kindly address them to your respective advisors. Thank you.